The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a reddish glow across the gravel lot of a roadside diner that had stood there for generations. J.D. Vance stepped out of his car, his shoulders slumped from a marathon day of meetings, forced smiles, and endless chatter about policies that felt miles away from places like this. All he wanted was a burger, something simple, something real, before the long drive back to wherever home was these days. A local had tipped him off about this spot earlier, raving about their homemade meatloaf and fries cut right in the kitchen. Sounded like the kind of meal that could quiet the noise in his head. He pushed the door open, and a little bell jingled overhead, sharp and clear against the low murmur inside. The air hit him first, thick with the smell of sizzling beef, smoky bacon grease, and coffee that had been brewing since sunrise. It was a small place, worn but warm, the kind where booths creaked under the weight of regulars who'd been coming forever. A wall near the register was plastered with faded snapshots, smiling faces, old staff, kids holding milkshakes from years gone by. The hum of voices floated around him, soft but steady, like the diner itself was breathing. J.D. took a step forward, his boots scuffing the linoleum, and caught the eye of the woman behind the counter. She was mid-30s, maybe, with tired lines around her eyes and a ponytail that had started to slip. She flashed a quick smile, automatic, practiced, until her gaze lingered a second too long. Recognition flickered across her face, fast as a match striking, and that smile froze. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands hesitated over the stack of menus she'd been straightening. J.D. noticed it. He always noticed those little shifts, the ones people didn't think he'd catch. Around him, the room started to change. A guy in a faded cap, halfway through a bite of his burger, leaned over to mutter something to the woman across from him. She nodded, her eyes darting toward J.D. before snapping back to her plate. Another customer, a woman in a plaid jacket, set her coffee mug down hard enough to make it clink, her jaw tightening as she stared at the wall. The air felt heavier now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. J.D. wasn't new to this. He'd walked into plenty of places where the welcome mat wasn't rolled out. But here, in a diner that smelled like comfort and sounded like home, this was different. The woman behind the counter, her name tag read Sarah, cleared her throat, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. Good evening, she said, her voice careful, like she was stepping over broken glass. You eating here or taking it to go? J.D. let out a tired chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. Eating here, if that's okay. Her pause stretched too long for a simple question. She glanced back toward the kitchen, where shadows moved behind a steamed-up window, then turned to him again. Hang on, she said, her tone clipped. I need to check something. And just like that, she slipped through the swinging door, leaving him standing there, alone in the spotlight of a dozen quiet stares. The diner wasn't loud anymore. The clatter of a fork against a plate echoed somewhere. A guy at the counter shifted, his stool creaking. Someone coughed, sharp and deliberate. J.D. rolled his shoulders, exhaling slow. He wasn't about to jump to conclusions. Maybe they were short-staffed, maybe it was a mix-up. But the way those eyes followed him, the way the room tightened like a coiled spring, told him this wasn't about seating. This was about him. And he had no idea why. Here's the thing. J.D. didn't know it yet, but he'd just walked into a moment that'd stick with him, a moment that'd make you wonder. What would you do if a place you thought was safe turned you away? That's where this story's headed, folks, and trust me, it's about to get real. Stick around, because in a world where everyone's quick to judge, what happens next might surprise you. Oh, and before we keep going, drop a comment below. Have you ever stepped into a room and felt the air change? Tell me about it. I'm reading every word. J.D. Vance stood there, the diner's bell still echoing in his ears from when he'd walked in just moments ago. The warmth he'd expected, the kind that comes with greasy comfort food in a quiet booth, was slipping away fast. Sarah, the woman behind the counter, had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him under the weight of too many eyes. He shifted his stance, hands sliding into his pockets, and scanned the room. It wasn't subtle anymore. The guy in the faded cap paused mid-chew, his burger hovering as he whispered again to the woman across from him. She flicked her gaze at J.D., quick and sharp, then looked down like she'd been caught. The woman in the plaid jacket gripped her coffee mug tighter, her knuckles whitening, before she took a swig and stared out the window into the dark. The air buzzed with something unspoken. JD knew that feeling. He'd felt it in boardrooms, on campaign trails, in places where his name carried baggage he couldn't always shake. But this was a diner, for crying out loud. A place where people came to eat, not to judge. Or so he'd thought. A low mutter rippled from a booth in the corner, too soft to catch the words, but the tone was clear, edgy, suspicious. Someone coughed again, louder this time, like they were testing the silence. JD kept his face steady, but inside, his pulse ticked up. He wasn't naive. He'd been the outsider before. Still, this hit different. Sarah pushed back through the swinging kitchen door, her steps quick and her expression set. No more hesitation in her eyes, just a decision, cold and final. She stopped a few feet from him, arms crossed, and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't serve you tonight." Her voice was firm, louder than it needed to be, like she wanted the whole room to hear. And they did. The diner went still, not silent, not yet, but still enough that the sizzle of the grill in the back sounded like a crackling fire. A fork scraped a plate somewhere, sharp and jarring. JD let the words hang there, heavy as a slammed door. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Can't serve me?" he repeated, keeping his tone even, almost curious. Sarah didn't flinch this time. "That's right," she said, her chin lifting a fraction. "We'd rather not." No explanation, no apology beyond that first sorry. Just a wall of a sentence, built to keep him out. JD exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. Was it him? His face? His job? He'd walked in here as a guy hungry for a meal, not a headline, but something told him this wasn't about food anymore. He glanced past her to the kitchen window. Two cooks stood there, half hidden behind a stack of plates, watching like hawks. Their faces were shadows, unreadable, but their stillness said plenty. "Is it something I did?" JD asked, his voice low but clear. Sarah's lips twitched, like she wanted to say more but wouldn't. "It's just, we're not serving you tonight," she said again, doubling down. The guy at the counter shifted again, his stool groaning under him. A younger man in a booth, lean, scruffy, maybe late 20s, leaned back with a smirk, arms crossed like he was settling in for a fight. The woman in plaid shot JD another look, her eyes narrowing before she turned away. The room was a chessboard now, and he was the piece nobody wanted to move. JD could have walked out, could have shaken his head, climbed back into his car, and let the night swallow this whole thing. But he didn't. He squared his shoulders and said, "All right. Can I talk to whoever's in charge?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard. A short laugh barked from the booth where the smirking guy Saturday. "Seriously," the guy muttered, loud enough to carry. Heads turned. The tension spiked, electric and raw. Sarah hesitated, then nodded once. "One SEC," she said, and slipped back into the kitchen again, leaving JD standing there, the center of a storm he hadn't seen coming. This wasn't just a no anymore. It was a line in the sand. And JD wasn't the type to back down easy. What happens when a guy like him, someone you'd recognize from the news, gets shut out of a place like this? That's where this is going, and it's about to get messy. You ever been told you're not welcome somewhere you thought you belonged? But it stung. But it made you wonder why. Stick with me. We're peeling this onion layer by layer, and the next one's gonna sting too. JD Vance stood rooted to the spot, the diner's air thick with the sting of rejection. Sarah had vanished back into the kitchen after his request to speak to someone in charge, and now the room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see if he'd push back or walk away. He wasn't walking, not yet. The guy in the booth, the one with the smirk and the crossed arms, let out that short, mocking laugh again, like JD was some kind of sideshow. The woman in plaid shifted in her seat, her coffee forgotten, her eyes flicking between him and the kitchen door. The guy at the counter, older, grizzled, in a jacket that had seen better days, shook his head slow, like he was disappointed in the whole mess. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was loaded. The grill hissed faintly in the back, a plate clinked somewhere, but the chatter that had filled the place when JD walked in was gone. He could feel the stares, some quick and sneaky, others bold and unblinking. He'd been here before, not in this diner, not in this exact moment, but in rooms where his presence shifted the temperature. He'd learned to read it, to feel the undercurrent. And right now, that undercurrent was pulling hard against him. This wasn't about a full house or a late hour. This was personal, and he needed to know why. The kitchen door swung open again, and out stepped a man, broad-shouldered, maybe late 40s, with a grease-stained apron tied loose around his waist. His name tag said Mike, scratched and faded, like it had been through a few too many shifts. He didn't walk over slow or careful. He came straight at JD, arms crossed, sizing him up with a look that wasn't friendly but wasn't quite hostile either. "Heard you've got a question," Mike said, his voice rough, like gravel under boots. It wasn't a greeting. It was a challenge, daring JD to make this a thing. JD met his stare, calm as a lake on a windless day. "Yeah," he said, keeping it simple. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Mike snorted, a sharp puff of air through his nose, and wiped his hands on his apron, leaving faint streaks of flour. He glanced around the diner, taking in the faces turned their way, some pretending not to watch, others not bothering to hide it. "Folks around here," Mike said, his words slow, deliberate. "They've got their thoughts about you, about what you stand for." "Me? I've got a place to run. Don't need trouble." JD raised an eyebrow, letting that sink in. "Me eating here's trouble?" he asked, his tone still even, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet push. Mike didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and he rubbed the back of his neck, like the weight of the room was pressing on him too. Behind him, the cooks in the kitchen leaned closer to the pass-through, their shadows stretching across the counter. The smirking guy in the booth, Colin Travis, leaned forward, elbows on the table, like he was itching to jump in. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, but it sounded bitter. "Look," Mike said finally, dropping his hand from his neck, "it's not about you personally. Least, not for me." JD tilted his head. "Feels pretty personal," he said, and there it was, the first crack in the wall between them. Mike's eyes flickered, just for a second, like he hadn't expected that. But before he could respond, Travis piped up from his booth, voice loud and cutting. "It's not complicated, man," he said, grinning like he'd won something. "You're just not welcome. Deal with it." JD turned toward him, slow and deliberate, taking him in, scruffy hair, worn hoodie, the kind of guy who'd argue just to hear himself talk. "Not welcome," JD repeated, letting the words settle. Travis shrugged, leaning back again. "Yeah, simple as that." The diner stayed quiet, every ear tuned to the exchange. Mike shifted his weight, glancing at Travis, then back at JD, like he wasn't sure whose side he was on anymore. The line in the sand was drawn, all right, and JD was still standing on the wrong side of it. But here's where it gets wild. JD didn't storm out, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, steady, like a man who'd faced worse and come out the other side. What would you do if someone drew that line against you? Fight? Leave? Or dig in deeper? That's the question, and JD's about to answer it in a way nobody saw coming. Keep listening. This diner's about to turn into a battlefield of words, and the next move's gonna hit hard. JD Vance didn't budge. The diner was a pressure cooker now. Travis's words, "You're just not welcome," still ringing in the air like a dare. Mike stood there, arms crossed, caught between the scruffy loudmouth in the booth and the man he'd just refused to serve. The older guy at the counter kept his head down, picking at his food, but his fork hadn't moved in a while. The woman in plaid stared out the window, her coffee cold. The cooks in the back leaned closer to the pass-through, their shadows stretching long across the counter. Every eye was on JD, waiting for him to snap, to storm out, to give them the fight they half expected. But JD didn't give them that. Instead, he pulled out a chair from the nearest table, slow, deliberate, the scrape of metal on linoleum cutting through the silence, and sat down. "Then let's talk," he said, resting his hands on the tabletop, his voice steady as steel. The room froze. Travis's smirk faltered, his arms uncrossing for a split second. Mike blinked, like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. "Talk," he repeated, leaning on the chair across from JD, not sitting yet, his apron dusted with flour from a long shift. "Yeah," JD said, meeting his gaze. "You don't want me here. I get that. But I don't get why. So let's talk about it." A low chuckle rolled out from Travis's booth. "Man, this guy's got guts," he said, shaking his head, but there was a hitch in his voice, like he wasn't as sure of himself anymore. The diner wasn't used to this. People didn't sit down in the middle of a standoff. They yelled, they left, they made a scene. But JD just sat there, calm as a man waiting for his coffee, like he had nowhere else to be. Mike sighed, long and heavy, and ran a hand over his face. "I run a business," he said finally. "I don't pick fights. Don't want headlines. But I've got people to think about, folks who come here every day." JD nodded, leaning forward just a touch. "All right. So what do those folks think about me?" Mike glanced over his shoulder, like he half expected someone to answer for him. The older man at the counter, Colin Ray, shifted, his jacket creaking, but he stayed quiet. Travis didn't. "They think you're full of it," he shot back, his grin creeping back. All that talk about understanding regular people, but you're just another suit playing the game. JD turned to him, slow, sizing him up. Okay, he said. Tell me what I should have done different. Travis blinked hard. That wasn't the comeback he'd braced for. His mouth opened, then shut, like a fish gasping on dry land. Mike watched the exchange, his fingers tapping the back of the chair. You don't know us, he said, turning back to JD. Not really. JD shrugged, just a little. No, I don't. But if I was just some guy off the road, no name, no face you'd seen before, would we be doing this? The question hung there, sharp and quiet. Mike's expression shifted, not much, but enough. A crack in the armor. Ray spoke up then, his voice rough from years of hard living. Sounds like the old days, he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Folks in suits showing up, promising the world, then gone by morning. Same story, different face. JD looked at him, letting the words settle. I've heard that story, he said. Lived it, too. The diner stayed quiet, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It wasn't just tension now, it was something else, something teetering on the edge of understanding. Mike still hadn't sat down, but his grip on the chair loosened. Travis leaned back, arms crossed again, but his smirk was gone. The woman in plaid stole a glance at JD, her jaw softening for the first time. The cooks in the back didn't move, but their eyes stayed locked on the scene. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a conversation, and JD had flipped the script. Ever had someone call your bluff and leave you scrambling? That's what's happening here, and it's only getting started. What happens when the guy everyone's ready to hate turns the table literally and starts listening? That's the twist you didn't see coming, and it's about to crack this whole thing wide open. Stay tuned. The next move's gonna change everything. JD Vance sat at the table, hands resting easy, the diner caught in that fragile shift from standoff to something else. Ray's words about broken promises still lingered, a rough echo of a past this place couldn't shake. Mike leaned on the chair across from JD, his apron creased and worn, his face a mix of doubt and curiosity. Travis slumped back in his booth, arms crossed tight, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. He didn't have an answer to JD's question, and it showed. The woman in plaid stole another glance, her coffee mug untouched now, while the cooks in the back stood like statues, watching through the kitchen window. Mike broke the silence first. Folks here, he said, his voice low, they've got long memories. Every handshake, every promise, they hold on to it. And when nothing changes, they don't forget. JD nodded, slow and deliberate. I get that, he said. I've seen it. Grew up around it. Watched people get left behind, felt it myself. His words weren't loud, weren't preachy, but they landed like stones in still water, rippling out. Mike's fingers tapped the chair, his brow furrowing, like he was trying to square that with the guy he'd pegged JD to be. Travis snorted, trying to claw back some ground. Sure you did, he said, his tone sharp, but less sure. That's what they all say. JD turned to him, steady as ever. You decided who I was before I walked in, he said. Wanted me to blow up, give you a reason to feel right. What if I told you I know that frustration lifted? Travis's jaw twitched, but no comeback came. He leaned back further, staring at the ceiling like he'd run out of ammo. Ray spoke up again, his voice cutting through the hush. Worked my whole life in a factory, he said, setting his coffee down with a soft clunk. Watch this town dry up, jobs gone, families gone. People like you roll in, talk big, then roll out. Never changes. He paused, his weathered eyes locking on JD, but you're the first one who's stuck around to hear it. That hit different. The diner shifted, subtle, but real. The woman in plaid softened her grip on her mug. Travis's arms loosened just a fraction. Even the cooks tilted their heads like they were seeing JD for the first time. JD let the silence breathe, then looked back at Mike. So what now? He asked, voice calm but pointed. Mike exhaled, long and ragged, and glanced toward the kitchen. The weight of the moment pressed on him. Run a business, keep the peace, or take a chance. He rubbed his neck, then called out, Jenny. A waitress, mid-20s, ponytail swinging, peeked out from behind the counter, her eyes wide. Get him a menu, Mike said, his tone gruff but final. A ripple ran through the room. Travis scoffed, but it was half-hearted. The woman in plaid raised an eyebrow. Ray smirked, just a little. Jenny hesitated, then grabbed a laminated menu and walked it over, setting it in front of JD with a quick nod. Coffee? She asked, her voice small. Yeah, thanks, JD said, taking the menu. She poured him a cup, steam curling up, and muttered, It's strong. JD took a sip, winced slightly, and deadpanned, Tastes like it. A chuckle broke out, soft at first, from Ray, then Mike cracked a grin, shaking his head. The woman in plaid hid a smile behind her mug. Even Travis's lip twitched, like he didn't want to laugh but couldn't help it. The ice was breaking not all the way, but enough. The diner didn't feel like a battleground anymore. Plates clinked again. A low hum of talk started to rebuild. JD held the menu, but his eyes were on the people, the ones who'd shut him out, then let him in, inch by inch. Ever had a moment where you thought you knew someone, then they flipped the script and left you second-guessing? That's what's unfolding here, and it's not over yet. What happens when a refused man gets a seat at the table, literally? That's the next beat, and it's gonna leave a mark. Keep with me. This story's got one more twist to throw your way. J.D. Vance sat at the table, the laminated menu in his hands, but he wasn't reading it. Not really. His eyes moved across the diner, taking in the shift that had settled over the place like dust after a storm. Mike dropped into the chair across from him, his broad frame slumping a little, like the weight of the night had finally caught up. Ginny hovered nearby, refilling Ray's coffee at the counter, her ponytail bouncing as she darted glances at J.D. Travis stayed in his booth, arms still crossed, but the fight had drained out of him. His stare was more curious now than cutting. The woman in plaid sipped her cold coffee, her posture looser, like she'd let go of whatever grudge she'd been nursing. Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Ever had this happen before? He asked, his voice gruff but genuine. J.D. thought about it, not just the brush-offs he'd gotten in his line of work, but this exact kind of moment, where a simple meal turned into a showdown. Not like this, he admitted, setting the menu down. Most folks in my shoes would have walked out by now. Made a call, maybe turned this into tomorrow's news. Mike huffed a laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, figured you'd have a lawyer on speed dial or something. J.D. smirked, just a flicker. Crossed my mind, he said. Mike grinned, a real one this time, not just a crack in his guard. Can't say I won't regret this come morning, he added, rubbing his neck. That's fair, J.D. replied, leaning back. The diner was waking up around them, forks clinked against plates, a low murmur of voices crept back in. Ginny appeared a minute later, sliding a plate in front of J.D., a cheeseburger, fries piled high, the kind of meal that looked like it belonged here, simple and honest. She stepped back, hands on her hips. Enjoy, she said, almost like a dare. J.D. picked up the burger, took a bite, and chewed slow. The room watched, not obvious about it, but they watched. He swallowed, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and said, deadpan, little dry. For a heartbeat, the diner went still, then Mike barked out a laugh, loud and unguarded. Ray chuckled, shaking his head. Smartass, he muttered, grinning into his coffee. Jenny smirked, rolling her eyes as she turned back to the counter. Even Travis let out a snort, covering it with a cough. The woman in plaid hid a smile behind her mug. The tension didn't just break, it melted, like grease on a hot grill. All right, Mike said, still chuckling, you're a piece of work. J.D. nodded, taking another bite. Been told that before. The diner settled into itself again, plates rattling, coffee pouring, voices weaving together. Ray glanced over one last time. Still a shame a man can't just get a damn burger, he said, his tone lighter now. J.D. raised the burger slightly. Fix that, he replied, and Ray tipped his mug in a quiet salute. Travis didn't say anything, but his arms uncrossed, and he picked at his fries, stealing looks at J.D. like he wasn't sure what to make of him anymore. What started as a slammed door had turned into something else, something no one in that diner would forget. J.D. finished his meal, the taste of it lingering, but it wasn't just about the food. It was about staying when everyone expected him to go, listening when they thought he'd shout. The place hummed with life again, not the same as when he'd walked in, but better somehow, less divided, more human. Mike stood, heading back to the kitchen, but not before tossing J.D. a nod, like they'd settled something without saying it. Here's the kicker, folks. This isn't just a story about a burger. It's about what happens when you don't run from the hard stuff, when you sit down and face it. Ever been in a spot where walking away felt easy, but staying felt right? That's what J.D. did, and it changed the game. So, I've got a question for you. Drop it in the comments. When's the last time you stayed to listen instead of heading for the door? I'm reading everyone, promise. If this hit you where it counts, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell. There's more stories like this coming, and I'm not done telling them. See you next time.